I was brought up by a single mother who was the secretary of the Nurses Union. So I say that I was brought up by a really strong mother who was a fantastic model of getting stuff done. She, though, was very creative and put that on hold. She was the classic woman of her generation who was told she could be a nurse or a teacher. She wanted to go to art school and her father didn't allow it. So she put it on hold and she's finally retired and now she's pursuing art again. So it's interesting. So I was brought up by someone who loved art and who painted and drew all the time, but wasn't making a career of it at that point. I did an arts degree at VCA, a fine arts degree, and in my final year of that, I was pregnant with my first baby. So I was 27 and it was the first shock of what it means to have a child, because I was relegated to the stairwell. So while everyone else was painting in the main art room, because of the fumes and so on, they had a policy that meant I had to sit in the stairwell and draw. So I sat in the stairwell and actually did drawings from the ultrasound pictures of my baby. It was a strange thing to be in my final year of art school, heavily pregnant, you know, with all these young things around me, because I'd gone to art school a bit later. I had a reasonably straightforward birth, but a really difficult transition into breastfeeding, and it took about 4 months to get the breastfeeding right, and it was my 24-hour-a-day occupation, just trying to feed my baby. So I was expressing every feed, and you know, anyone who expresses feeds knows what that's like. You basically express for an hour, feed for an hour, then you have an hour before you start expressing again. And I remember just feeling quite shocked by how much my life had just been tipped on its head. And I think before you have a baby, you think, you know, there's going to be all this space and time to do all these things that you've always wanted to do. I thought I was going to be writing and painting while my baby slept. You know, you just have those fantasies. And so it felt like a very rude awakening. And at that point, I wanted to know if this was just me, if this was my problem, if I just couldn't get my shit together, if I just was never committed or dedicated enough as an artist to really make it work, or if maybe this was a more universal issue and other women felt this tension between their own needs and their own interests and this all-consuming job of raising a child. So I just started looking around for stories and I couldn't find any, really. I didn't find any books on the subject. And when I listened to interviews with female artists, it would often be mentioned. You would often hear them say something about the constraints of having a family, or even the benefits of having a child to their work. But I would notice that the interviewer would never pick up on it. It was like that was an aside, and I felt that it was important to them, but it was rarely recognised as something worth, you know, continuing to talk about. So I started just seeking out women that interested me, that I liked, asking them if they would meet me for an hour for a chat. I was a journalist by background, so that came fairly naturally to me, and they surprised me in their willingness to meet me and talk on this subject, because it's a very personal subject. So that's where it all began. I didn't know it was going to be a book at that point. I just thought this was just for me. Yeah, to wrap my head around what it might look like, to actually seek out some role models, I think, as well, of women who are managing to keep their artistic lives going amid all the clutter of family life. I think I did the interviews over a really long period of time. So I had another baby while I was still in the process of gathering the interviews. And I felt like it was important. The more I did these interviews, the more I felt that when I met these artists, they felt it was important. They were really grateful to talk about it. They felt like they'd never been asked to have a serious conversation about the subject of, you know, the intersection of their mothering and their artistic lives and identities and ambitions. There's all sort of yummy mummy stuff out there, particularly at that time. It was really the beginning of that time where, you know, it was trendy to have a baby on your hip and that kind of thing. But it was the stuff of gossip magazines. No one was sort of talking more seriously about what was a deeply felt issue for women. And I suppose it was because of their openness and the fact that I felt like they were giving me so much in these interviews that they deserved for it to go somewhere. And then I started talking to publishers, so just ringing them up and putting my proposal forward, and almost every one of them said, you know, I think it's an article, I don't really think it's a book. And I got a lot of sort of devil's advocate questions, I suppose, that, you know, what's so special about artists? Why women? Why mothers are not fathers? Aren't all women creative? Isn't mothering inherently creative? Aren't all working mothers struggling? All of those kinds of questions, sort of the why is this a special subject in deserving of a special book? And that was confronting because I just hadn't sort of I hadn't developed that kind of argument in my own mind. I just felt like it was significant to me, and therefore I was assuming that it might be significant to others. And so I started having to think like that, like how could I actually argue for the book? At which point I just had to say, you know, I don't think artist mothers are special. I just think they're particular, and that they have a particular take on mothering, and that isn't being represented anywhere else. I hadn't seen a book along those lines. And so eventually I convinced someone to take it on. There were universals. I mean, the sense that women artists want to be in two places at once is a really common feeling. And so there's often that sense of feeling torn between wanting to be with their work and wanting to be present for their children. That's probably the tough one, and you know, there's a swathe of guilt that comes with that, and you never get away from the word guilt when you're talking to mothers, sadly. But most of them felt that the benefits outweighed the sacrifices that they were making. The Divided Heart's one of those funny books where you feel like everyone has read it, but it's just that everyone you know has read it. It's a bit like being part of any small creative community or small community of any kind where it's significant to that community. And I'm so happy that it found its place and it's meant something to people. And I suppose that means that it sort of plugged me into this community of people, and I'm asked to do a lot of things. I'm asked to speak quite often at events. I've been asked to launch a lot of books and exhibitions. I'm interviewed a lot for blogs and so on. None of that was expected, and it's both wonderful and difficult for me because I work full time. I think the interesting thing about having children is that it seems to be the point at which people reevaluate their lives, and the great benefit of that is that if you have a passion, you can feel like it's now or never. The stakes are lifted because you have children, because your time is so limited, and because you can see the trajectory of your life roll out in front of you differently when you have a child, and because you want to make your children proud and provide a role model of doing the things that you love doing and showing them that there's a way and that it can be done. And so there's a whole lot of things that come together that make that a really potent time. And so for a lot of the artists that I interviewed, they talked about that having children was the best kick up the arse they got for just getting on with things. Sort of the fluff of life fell away, they got back to the essentials, they realised what was worth their time and what wasn't. And that's the great reward of having children. One of the many great rewards of having children is if you can use your time well, because that's the trade-off. You have very limited time, but if you recognise that as a benefit, because it forces you to work fast, it forces you to switch it on and off, you become much more pragmatic about the way you work. If you can sort of harness that, it makes so many women I meet just so incredibly prolific, because they just don't muck about. I think that you end up having a lot of your work living inside you all the time, and that can be frustrating at times when you don't feel like you can get it down or get at it when you want to. That can be extremely frustrating. And so I think I've just learnt that things won't last, things don't stay, so you've got to capture things quickly, and I've got much better at that. So when something comes to me, I've got a bag full of envelopes with things scribbled on the back, or I've just got used to always having something I can write on anywhere I am, because all your best ideas come to you in the most inconvenient places and times. I've got used to holding a lot in my brain that probably I used to just have the freedom to utilise then and there. And so I work full time, and I work in a really demanding job as a communications manager for the Australian Education Union. So I think it is a matter of just putting your creativity, sort of stuffing it around the edges. So I write at night, and The Divided Heart was completely written between the hours of 10 p.m. and midnight over a really long time. And I think it's that too. It's cutting yourself some slack, being comfortable with the fact that things might take a bit longer, that you might put things on hold, kids will get sick, it'll stop-start, but that if you keep that thread going, that you'll be able to keep tapping back into it and if you need to. It's a lot of faith. I think you have to have a lot of faith. Creativity is so broad, and I sort of wish I'd had the vision to recognise that when I was younger, because now I'm surrounded by illustrators and designers and architects, or people who've turned their creativity to all sorts of amazing, interesting careers, and online has really broadened that up too. So I think it's partly about just recognising that creativity isn't just about being a capital A artist, and that there are just so many ways you could go in terms of forging a creative career.